let us, before we finish this discussion, I'd like us to say a word or two about Schopenhauer's influence on other people. He's had enormous influence on creative artists, and I referred to that. I didn't name any, but one might name Wagner an enormous influence, Turgenev an enormous influence. In fact, lots of major novelists of the last 100 years, Conrad, Thomas Hardy, Proust, Thomas Mann. But perhaps in a discussion which is about philosophy, what we ought to concentrate on is not that so much as his influence on other major thinkers. And I think three stand out in importance: Nietzsche, Freud, and Wittgenstein, as having, in chronological order, as having been very obviously and strikingly influenced by Schopenhauer between his day and ours. Could you perhaps say something about his influence on Nietzsche?
As you know, Nietzsche regarded Schopenhauer as an educator, and his early work, Schopenhauer as Educator, indicates, I think, that he thought of Schopenhauer as a man who wasn't content with the superficial view of things, but looked underneath and wasn't afraid to look the world and history in the face, and didn't try and gloss over everything as Leibniz did with talk about the best of all possible worlds, but really looked the world in the face, and was therefore a man of mental integrity. He also entirely agreed with Schopenhauer's subordination of intellect to will, in its first instance, a servant of the will. And also, I think he regarded Schopenhauer as a man of great independence of character, who didn't allow himself to be, his views to be dictated by society, but thought them out, or by his predecessors, for the matter of that, or other philosophers, but thought them out for himself. I think, but he came, of course, to criticize, as you know, Schopenhauer in the course of time for his turning away from life. And although it's been said of Nietzsche by Professor Crane Brinton that the great Yesayer spent most of his life saying no, Nietzsche did officially uphold the affirming of the world as it is. And in a way, I sympathize with Nietzsche, because I think if the world is as Schopenhauer said it is, then the best thing is to try and alter it for the better. I don't say that Nietzsche, well, he thought, I mean, I wouldn't agree with Nietzsche's idea of what would be for the better, but I do agree with Nietzsche. But on the other hand, he never ceased to admire Schopenhauer and revere him as a man who set him on the right path, away from convention. It was a great question, I think.
Well, I think we must now turn finally to the latest of the great thinkers who was directly influenced by Schopenhauer, namely Wittgenstein. And perhaps you'd like to conclude this discussion by saying a little about Schopenhauer's influence on Wittgenstein.
Thank you. Yes, well, of course, that's quite clear, isn't it? I mean, from the preparatory, the material preparatory to the Tractatus in the notebooks and in the other manuscripts, the debt of Wittgenstein to Schopenhauer is made quite clear. And in the Tractatus itself, this idea to which you referred earlier in our conversation of the correlation between the subject and my world, that is strong in Wittgenstein, that there's I and my world, and that the I, the epistemological subject, is, as it were, the boundary of my world. It's not an object in my world, and because if I try to think of myself, then there's the I that's trying to think of myself. But it's on the borderline, as it were, of the world. That comes straight out of Schopenhauer. Then the famous saying in the Tractatus that if all the problems of science were answered, the problems of life wouldn't have been touched. That also really comes from Schopenhauer, I think. And it's also noteworthy that in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein makes a distinction between the will as the bearer of ethics, of which he says nothing can really be said. That's the metaphenomenal will. And the will as a phenomenon, which is really forms part of the subject matter of psychology, rather than of philosophy for the author of the Tractatus. And therefore, there is that distinction between the metaphysical will, I think, the metaphenomenal will and the phenomenal will, which also can be traced, I think, to Schopenhauer. I should say that Wittgenstein, in the course of time, became less and less Schopenhauerian, in the sense that he became less and less addicted to forming a system, whereas, as you said much earlier, Schopenhauer was certainly a system builder. There is a kind of embryo system in the Tractatus, but there's very little, as we all know, in the later writings of Wittgenstein. And but still, he undoubtedly was strongly influenced by Schopenhauer. In fact, he's about the only major philosopher of the past, it was in no sense contemporary, that Wittgenstein had really read and studied and digested at all, I think. It shows that the influence of Schopenhauer by no means ended with the 19th century, but as you said earlier, it slipped on into the 20th century and is embodied in one of the most famous philosophers of our century and time.
Thank you very much, Professor Copleston.